Welcome back to Red Flags Rising. I'm here yet again with Brent Carlson, director of the Berkeley Research Group, and my name is Mike Heinecke. I am the co-chair of E07 Reed's Sanctions, Export Controls, and AML Practice. Brent, how are you doing?
Excellent. It is always nice to be here and have a chat with you today, Mike.
It is Monday, April 14th, 2025. So, Brent, one thing that struck us as interesting from last week were a few developments about enforcement of export controls. Not necessarily yet any announcements as to settlements or fines or penalties, but some precursors to that. What did we see in the news last week, Brent?
So, a couple interesting things in terms of potentially increasing level of administrative subpoenas, as well as potential higher penalties coming down the pike. Let's take a look at what's going on. Uncertainty rules the roost these days. We can see this playing out in the tariff world. Are the reciprocal tariffs on? Are they off? How about for China? Are they on? Are they rising? Are they decreasing? Are there exemptions? How is this going to shake out? How is the unfolding trade war between the US and China going to pan out? What are the directions there? What do we see happening? There's a world of uncertainty there. But amid this world of uncertainty, we have clarity right here in the signals around export controls. All right, let's talk about what we saw in the news last week that talks about these indications out there. Number one, there was an article on April 8th in Reuters that was pointing to TSMC potentially facing a $1 billion plus penalty for sales into China. The second article was one we saw in Export Compliance Daily on April 10th that gave the indication that the Commerce Department, BIS, may be issuing more administrative subpoenas out there. Mike, let's unpack each of these.
Well, Brent, you're absolutely right to identify export controls enforcement as an area where there might actually be clarity amid the chaos. There's been a consistent line running through the statements of the new administration, really from the beginning, day zero of the administration, through the confirmation hearings of not only Howard Lutnick, but others within the Department of Commerce, that more enforcement is coming. How do they bring enforcement cases? By getting facts. Sometimes they get those facts through friendly outreach visits, sometimes through a little bit more coercive activities like subpoenas or visits by the Joint Strike Force with the FBI in tow. What's significant about the first article, just to begin with, is who it's by. Karen Freifeld is someone that you and I have read regularly because she has for years been breaking important stories in the semiconductor space. So it's worth following what she does very closely. In that article, she talks about TSMC facing potentially a $1 billion fine for selling not directly to Huawei, not putting Huawei on the shipping label of the box and sending it without a care in the world, but essentially potentially being duped by Huawei into sending sensitive items to third parties when really it was for Huawei the entire time. A lot of things we don't know. We should be very clear about this. We don't represent TSMC. We don't know what due diligence was done. We don't know to what extent they've already cooperated on some of these facts with the government. We know they stated in prior reporting a few months ago that they were doing indeed just that they were cooperating with the US government. So whether this ends up being a $1 billion penalty and whether TSMC pays a penalty is still, I think, from a public record perspective, still not yet decided. All of that said, the article is a great illustration of the potential risks of proceeding in the face of red flags without doing appropriate risk-based due diligence. Again, not knowing what exactly happened here, if the facts in the article were the only facts and another company was presented with the same facts, that company would need to be very careful to do risk-based due diligence. We've talked about exactly those types of challenges and some potential solutions in some of our prior articles, Brent. How to find those circumstantial data points that are both holistic and dynamic that would help you identify what would your normal business be with a particular company and has something changed about the quantity, the urgency, the approach, the price that customer is now willing to pay.
I think on this case, it was one where the company TSMC was shipping to, according to the Reuters article, was not on the entity list when they were shipping. It is now. In any company out there looking at upgrading and maintaining the strength and integrity of its export controls compliance program, How do we avoid that situation where you've got the government coming in an enforcement situation with 2020 hindsight? They would say, well, you weren't duped here. You had an awareness of a high probability that there could be evasion or diversion here. And so, what I think is interesting and something for folks to think about, and we've talked about this before in earlier pods, in our other articles, is looking at the facts and circumstances around customers that go onto the entity list and then what happened right after that. Did you see another customer come out of the woodwork looking for the same material, same specs, the same patterns, but not on the surface connected with that prior customer? That should raise some red flags.
Brent, what's really interesting is, and this is something, frankly, I hadn't thought about before, not only does the addition of an entity on the entity list raise exactly those questions that you just spoke about. Okay, well, what happens now going forward and how do we deal with this? Even if you take the right step and immediately stop shipments to that customer, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on, well, what did TSMC know before the entity list designation? It suggests that an important reflex to have is that if somebody to whom you're shipping items gets put on the entity list, not only do you need to stop that going forward conduct, but you need to also take a second look, probably with a little more skeptical perspective in hindsight, at, well, what did we know in the past about this entity? Look at why the U.S. government put them on the entity list. The U.S. government will expect you to take that bit of information and look back at your past sales. Remember, General Prohibition 10 at the end of the AR is not just forward-looking. It is a violation of the AR to do anything with knowledge of a past, present, or future violation of the EAR.
When we look at how is the government going to increase enforcement of export controls, it's been expressing this desire to do so for a very long time. There's been bipartisan pressure from Congress to do so for a very long time. So how are they going to do that? What sort of new strategy that would be more effective? It comes down to how much they're going to leverage General Prohibition 10 and the full definition of knowledge, which includes the awareness of a high probability.
Absolutely.
One thing that may be helpful is if we walk through those stages of enforcement, let's say like roughly 3 stages. So you'd have an initial outreach visit from BIS. Then there's an administrative subpoena as the second level. And then as a third level, a charging order. Why don't we walk through those steps and talk about what can companies do to think about and manage the situations as they're going through each step to avoid going to the next stage?
Yeah, Brent, and it's not as inevitable as the stages of grief, for example. You don't have to progress through each one. How you respond to initial outreach efforts and initial discussions could very well determine whether there are further steps that are a bit more coercive. And even if there are such steps, what is your opportunity to have a meaningful dialogue with the regulators? BIS, unlike other agencies, I think, is very proactive and very intent on speaking to companies. They don't necessarily show up at the door with raid jackets on and subpoenas in hand. One challenge of these visits is that they are often unannounced or unscheduled. So you need to prepare for them in advance. One way you can do so is by thinking about, well, what have BIS officers asked other companies or said to other companies? Some of this is maybe a bit anecdotal, where they show up and say, we were just wondering if you have a compliance program. That's not a random question.
In that sort of situation, in order to avoid being lulled into an informal response, make sure you've got the legal and compliance teams involved every step of the way. Even having those experts who are specialists in mitigating enforcement risks run through questions and the material that's being provided to have a sense of what else BIS may be looking for. The world is changing. There might be some clues in there.
Sometimes they might say, well, we have intelligence that's relevant to you that we think we need to share with you, such as we see bad actors from bad countries looking to procure items from you because we see them searching your website or we see them searching for your products on other websites. In response to things like that, it's important to appreciate that they expect some action to result because of their warning. It may be that they never come back to you. It may be that they come back to you in a year. Maybe that they come back to you in a few weeks and say, so what have you done in response to the last time we spoke? You want to be in a position to say, we took it very seriously. Thank you for reaching out to us. here are the things we have done. It doesn't mean you have to launch a huge investigation and start reading emails or anything like that. It does mean you should think about, well, based on what I was told, how do I make sure that my colleagues, my sales team colleagues, my other export control team colleagues, my trade compliance colleagues, generally, legal and compliance, all know about the visit and what risks were identified in the visit.
They may also say, here's what we're seeing in the industry to be careful of.
Right. In that sense, this is just yet another page from the FCPA playbook. In that context, for the last 20 years, anytime there was an enforcement action in your industry, the government expected you to be aware of it and to take it as a learning opportunity. If you saw things in a settlement admitting that certain facts are evidence of bad conduct, you need to internalize that and make sure that you are also sensitive to that. It doesn't mean you have to agree or that you would admit that the same conduct is bad conduct if, for example, you were contesting a fine or a penalty or if you were adjudicating these issues. But you should at least appreciate that the government would look at those facts again at another company, maybe yours, and think that, okay, these are the same facts and we at least have a reason to investigate here.
We've talked in other pods and writings about applying a new mindset, a white-collar mindset to export controls compliance, because certainly in the enforcement world, the signals definitely look like they're going in that direction.
This is a good transition, Brent, to one article that caught our eye from last week, Export Compliance Daily by Ian Cohen, titled Government Baby Issuing More Export Control-Related Subpoenas, Industry Lawyer Says. Ian's reporting is about a freight forwarders conference at which a lawyer for the Freight Forwarders Association noted that he is seeing an increase in administrative subpoenas. It wasn't necessarily an increase in administrative subpoenas directed at the freight forwarders themselves. It was an increase in activity of subpoenas sent to the freight forwarders about their clients, their customers, maybe to whom they were sending things. There's a risk that the freight forwarders and the way they handle the response could get wrapped around the axle of an enforcement proceeding or investigation. After sending an administrative subpoena to the freight forwarders, it would be a natural next step for BIS to then go up and down the line to see what else they could find.
The article also talks about screening against government lists, and the entity list, and how it's become more challenging for companies. The bigger issue is red flags. The entity list is actually a lagging factor in the sense where those entities were added to it after there were issues discovered in some way, shape, or form that got them onto the list. But prior to that, there are red flags to be on the lookout for. Companies should make sure they're watching out for red flags around transactions that could signal a counterparty is looking to violate U.S. export controls. Every company's compliance team should be talking with employees across the enterprise so they know what to look for in terms of a potential red flag. Where we're going with export controls and where the enforcement is more of what red flags were there and were they mitigated or not. One key takeaway is it looks like there are definitely moves in the enforcement of backfield.
Brent, this article on Reuters from a few days before struck both of us as an opportune time to revisit one of our earlier Fresh Looks posts with the NYU Law School's program on corporate compliance and enforcement. We did a two-part series trying to help companies anticipate if and when they receive outreach or, unfortunately, an administrative subpoena, how to deal with both of those situations. Part one of this we issued on September 19th, 2024, which is really about the avoid part. And we've covered a lot of this already, I think, in our discussion today. Part two was what to do if you fail to avoid. So you're facing an administrative subpoena. Both are linked in the show notes.
So how to avoid kicking the hornet's nest. One principle from the martial arts world is the first rule of self-defense is don't be there. We've got the perfect environment for enforcement of export controls. And in this environment, the worst thing to do is kick the hornet's nest or pour gasoline on a smoldering fire, because that can lead you down a direction that gets increasingly harder to deal with.
Anytime you get a formal subpoena request from a government, whether it's from an administrative agency or a grand jury, immediately make sure that you are identifying and preserving relevant information. The worst possible thing that could happen is that, like with many white-collar situations, it's the cover-up or the perceived cover-up that actually gets people in trouble, not the underlying crime itself. If you receive an administrative subpoena, Carefully identify the information it's looking for, lock it down, make sure it's preserved. Ensure that the legal and compliance teams are involved in every step of the way. So, Brent, what about how you actually respond to, say, BIS or the FBI after you do get an administrative subpoena from the Commerce Department?
The situation fundamentally changes. I think one thing is just recognize that the voluntary self-disclosure window is now closed, but the cooperation door remains wide open. Engaging with BIS should be done in a proactive and thoughtful manner. So thinking where they may be going with this in terms of where a potential enforcement action may be in this new environment, in this new geopolitical environment. I think that's really important. I appreciate that courts are maybe differential to the national security underpinnings of BIS's authority and the implications of these transactions. BIS may have more information than you do, including from potential whistleblowers out there. So understand with all these factors in mind, after an administrative subpoena comes in, it goes from, let's say, a two-dimensional chess to a three-dimensional chess game.
Absolutely, Brent. We've talked previously about the importance of companies taking a holistic approach when they look at themselves for the purpose of identifying and mitigating export controls risk. In responding to any kind of request from the U.S. government for information, you need to appreciate that the U.S. government takes a holistic approach and that it shares information across agencies. You should assume that any information you provide in response to a Commerce Department subpoena could be shared with the Treasury Department, with the State Department, or even with the DOJ. If a case is sitting there for them and there's national security implications, it would be very dangerous to assume that they wouldn't explore that. The other point, Brent, that comes to mind, what might BIS ask for in their administrative subpoena or in a follow-up visit to an initial outreach where they're not maybe entirely satisfied with the response? They will go back to their prior guidance and they'll ask you, how are you incorporating this guidance into your current compliance program? Companies should anticipate that if, as a company, you continue to make shipments to counterparties about whom the government had previously warned you, including because you did risk-based due diligence, documented that due diligence, and came to an informed decision that actually maybe the government was wrong about that initial warning or that designation, you should fully expect that to be a question from the government the next time they visit. Brent, now again, back by popular demand, is Brent Carlson's Managing Up. Brent, based on the topic of today's podcast, what are important practical tips for trade compliance professionals to keep in mind as they manage up on those issues?
It's simple. While uncertainty reigns elsewhere, clarity resides right here with export controls. The signals are there. You can see the signal through all the noise. So let's avoid kicking the hornet's nest.
Well said, Brent. If someone does receive an administrative subpoena, how do they take that principle and then use that in the discussions they'll have with management and other stakeholders about the subpoena and about how to respond?
One of the interesting things about a period of uncertainty, it reminds us that one of the certain factors throughout business, a classical factor, is that business always changes. And that applies also to enforcement and compliance risks. As a company, we don't want to be fighting the last war in terms of compliance. For example, we went through a couple decades of FCPA enforcement, heavy enforcement activity. Now we have other priorities coming up, like export controls, driven by national security priorities, driven by geopolitical tensions. So it's important to say we need to be ahead of the game as a company in our legal and compliance function. Our export controls compliance program needs to be ahead of the game so it doesn't get caught in a mindset that's stuck in a prior time. Now is the time to anticipate where the enforcement is going to be coming from and what is the Commerce Department going to be leveraging in these enforcement actions. And that comes down to the full definition of knowledge under the EAR, which includes the awareness of a high probability. Make sure that you're updating your risk assessments to look for potential exposure from that high probability perspective. Then the second step would be to develop a protocol that incorporates that awareness of a high probability element throughout the export controls compliance program. Number three is to do a bit of spot testing to make sure that protocol that incorporates the awareness of a high probability awareness is rolled out throughout the company.
All great advice, Brent. It's also worth coming back to the point that the white collar enforcement, it's not the crime, it's the cover up that gets people in trouble. And while you don't want to be fear mongering when you're dealing with management, C suites, boards, other stakeholders, it is very important to protect them and the company from someone making a bad decision because they don't appreciate the seriousness of an administrative subpoena, say, compared to a grand jury subpoena, or if they don't appreciate the authorities that maybe BIS has because they've overinterpreted what they're reading in the press about the DOJ, for example, in the current administration.
Especially if you've got an enforcement action that starts out as a civil action from Commerce, but in the course of the investigation, evidence of actual knowledge by certain people within the company comes up that would then serve that platter up from a criminal perspective. That's definitely a risk factor to avoid completely.
Brent, that concludes our latest episode of Red Flags Rising. As always, it's been a pleasure. I hope people have found it useful and informative. Brent and I are always happy to have a virtual coffee or a real one if you happen to be in either DC or the Bay Area. Just let us know. Brent, be well.
Be well. And one last thought for everyone, despite all the clouds of uncertainty out there, above the clouds, it's always a sunny day.